Good morning, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to today's meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, also known as the GSSB, on today, Tuesday, the 17th of May, 2016. This in-person meeting is being hosted from the GRI Secretariat Office in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. My name is Maggie Lee, Senior Coordinator here at GRI, and also joining me is Pamela Carpio, Senior Coordinator, Governance Relations. Present staff from the Standards Division today are Laura Espinach, Sarah Kemke, Chelsea Reinhardt, and Bastian Buck, Director of the Standards Division. We'd like to extend a warm welcome today to Stan Rogers, who is a member of GRI's Due Process Committee, who joins us today as an observer. We'd like to note the apologies from the Global Sustainability Board members, Jürgen Buchsbaum and Robin Edme. And I'd like to start a roll call with the present GSSB members. Daniel Ingram.
Present.
David Russell.
Present.
Hidemi Tomita.
Present.
Jorge Daniel Tayant.
Present.
Judy Kazewski.
Present.
Kirsten Magreth Hovey.
Present.
Michael Nugent.
Present.
Simeon Cheng.
Present.
Stian Wandrag.
Present.
Sulema Pioli.
Present.
Varkpath Nankumar.
Present.
Dwight Justice.
Present.
And Mr. Eric Hespenheider, Chair of the GSSB.
Present.
Thank you, everyone. I'd like to hand over to Eric to open the meeting.
Great. Thank you, Maggie. And good morning, everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of our meetings. And again, a special thank you, Stan, for joining us today from the Due Process Oversight Committee as part of our due process protocol. So we appreciate your being able to join us today. So today we have a relatively short agenda, and we'll start out. I don't think I need to summarize what we did yesterday, since it was quite successful in terms of not only getting through our agenda, but getting it through a bit early. Today, we're going to take up the topic of the glossary of terms as our first item. Sarah will take us through that here in a moment. We'll then, depending on the timing, we'll either take a break at the conclusion of that session or slightly after. We then have the next major item, which would be the item 4, which is the rest of the topic-specific standards. You'll recall yesterday we had the conversation about 12 of them. We have another 18 that were subject to review by the GSSB, and having received no substantive comments, or in some cases, I would say any comments, I thank the board for their review. To the extent that there are some comments that you'd like to bring up on any of those 18, if you could signal that to us, soon, so that we can adjust the agenda as appropriate, that would be most helpful. The plan is to take those remaining standards, and unless there's an objection from the board, we'll approve them in mass, if you will, for public exposure. So that'll be our second agenda item following the glossary of terms. We'll then Chelsea will take us through the transition to standards, the review process that we're underway with regard to that. That one does involve, potentially anyway, some change of meeting dates that we had previously published, both for our benefit as well as for the public agenda meetings. So we'll have a conversation about what's involved with that. And then if there is any other business, we'll take it up at that point. Otherwise, we'll close the meeting following that session. So any questions with regard to the agenda? Any additions? Okay. All right. Well then, Sarah, I'll turn it over to you for item number 5 on the glossary of terms. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for your attention on the glossary this early in the morning. Before we start going over the glossary of terms and feedback and discussing the definitions, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the process that we went through to transition from the G4 guideline glossary to the GRI standards glossary. So first of all, we went through the G4 glossary, reviewed all of these terms for sense, utility, style, and format. Then the Employee Worker Technical Committee went over the terms of employee and worker and their related terminology. Based on these reviews, the terms were edited, added, or deleted, and input from the GSSB was figured into these as well. And the terms and definitions were also applied or given a new style and format for the GRI standards. So what is that style and format? The terms were defined in the singular version. Previously they had been plural, but it's best practice in definition setting and terminology to define the singular terms, so we did that. Previously terms had all been capitalized, but again, best practice says to leave them with singular, lowercase, right. Lowercase, unless they are a specific GRI term. So terms like reporting principle were left in uppercase. Definitions were written to replace the term in a sentence, and they were not to begun with an article, so no A's and these. And all examples, so some of these definitions were long, we had a lot of examples in the definition which were important for clarification, but were instead moved to a note below the definition if possible to make this easier to understand. So how do we anticipate that the standards glossary will be used? It'll be a standalone document. All of these terms will be included in the document in alphabetical order. And the terms will be identified in bold text in the standards. So in the standards text, they'll be bolded. Also in the electronic version, they will be hyperlinked so that when the user is reading through, they will be able to click on that link and be brought directly to the electronic version of the glossary. They will not be included in the back of each standard. And terms used within the GRI standards glossary will also be bolded and hyperlinked, so within that glossary, they'll be able to move between the different terms. All right, so with feedback received from the GSSB, thank you very much for taking a look at all the terms and reviewing them. One member had comments on the following definitions. Many of these paralleled some of the discussion we had yesterday about the 609 child labor and the OH&S standard 603, excuse me. So the first term we decided to look at was the young worker. That has now, as of the discussion yesterday, been defined in the guidance for the SR 609. So it is potentially possible to remove this term from the glossary if we feel so moved, but leave that up to your discussion. The second item for discussion were a number of terms that were used in the OH&S standard, the SRS 603, fatality, absentee rate, and injury rate. Again, many of those concerns were addressed during the discussion of the OH&S standard yesterday, and since it is slated for review as the next item, our suggestion would be to again, treat this as we are treating the standard and leave it up for review at the next time. But no other comments were received about the glossary terms in advance. And so I'll turn it over to Eric to lead through feedback and discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. So we did indeed talk about the young workers yesterday. Is this the only, just my question, is this the only instance where that term is used in the standards?
Yes.
Okay. So is there a recommendation from the standard division that we delete it from the glossary and just use the definition in the standard itself?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure I was clear on that. Okay. You have, as distributed yesterday as part of the materials, the full marked up version of the glossary, and so I just open it up to the board for any further discussion or dialogue with that one recommendation that the young workers, be deleted from the glossary and left in the only standard it is applicable to. And then the others that were highlighted, the recommendation is that we leave the definition as they are, subject to further review in a future period of the...
That's correct.
Okay. So, comments, questions from the board? Michael?
I've got a couple of observations which I didn't get in time, but I don't know whether right now's the right time or not. They're not.
It's probably the only time, so please.
Okay. Okay, so some of them, Some of the definitions I found were just examples. So that didn't seem to be a definition. So it's a general comment. I think I noticed two times where that was the case. So I wondered whether we wanted to keep them as definitions.
Okay, can we have the specifics?
Well, one was line 76. I've got a note to myself. So business partners, yes.
Business partners.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And, okay,
Okay. So shall I just keep going, or?
please.
Okay. The thing I raised yesterday about ands and ors, it does trouble me sometimes that we're imprecise. And line 103, 104 is an example of that. Community development program plan that details actions to minimise, mitigate, and compensate. So you have to do all three for adverse social and economic impacts. So it has to cover both. And it has to do not only the first part, but it has to do the second part as well, and to identify opportunities. So opportunities and actions, right? So, you know, that it has to satisfy absolutely everything in there to be included in the definition or to fall within the definition. And this happens quite a bit throughout our documents. So I think, so the way some address it is to say, is to use or and say somewhere that or means and or. That's IAASB does it that way. So I don't know whether you want to do it that way or not. But shall I keep going, Eric? Please. Sometimes it seems to me there's a lack of precision. So line 83, career ending, retirement by reaching statutory national retiring age or termination of employment. So I don't know if that's intended, but I mean, what if there is no national retirement age, or you just retire, and yeah. So, it seems overly precise, or in fact imprecise because of its precision. Line 412. Remuneration, I think it is. Yeah, remuneration. Just consistency with other things. I mean, there's a lot of attention paid to remuneration in accounting standards, whether we should try and be consistent with IFRS, or if there are other places, maybe the ILO or whatever. This is it doesn't look offensive, but I just wonder if it's comprehensive and consistent. Line 425. It's just inconsistencies within. So line 425 says ecological cycles or agricultural processes, and sometimes, so in line 418, 419, and a couple of other times referring to the same thing, we don't add or agricultural processes. Now that might be correct, but it's just something that jumped out as me, perhaps from a non-technical view. And the last one was line 336. It's just a suggestion. I wonder whether we should have social media in there or not in marketing communications. So those were they.
Thank you. Chelsea?
I think one thing to bear in mind, these are all very good observations. Every term that's carried through that's not in red is just basically transition verbatim from G4. So I would encourage the group to fix the things that we think are definitely easy fixes and clearly broken. But also one of the outcomes of the process Sarah's been working on will be a clearer template for how project working groups in the future need to be defining terms, referencing other sources, the kinds of notes and explanations, examples versus definitions. So we do think that this will be part of the continued improvement process going forward as we start to undertake reviews of the standards.
So any particular comment on any of those with regard to ease of fix, or we can?
The changes are all possible to make. We can go through and we can sit with Michael and go through these in more detail. I don't think they're problematic. It's more about what we want to be cautious of is sometimes in our grammatical editing, we actually change meanings unintentionally where we didn't understand the G4 context. That is the risk that we run, but it's up for this group to determine, I think, whether the benefits outweigh that slight potential or not. We defer to you guys.
Okay, so we'll circle back here in a minute, Michael, in terms of what we end up with. So I saw Kirsten and Daniel, and then Dwight.
Line 207,
Fatality. I've given the comment to the standards board, the standards department earlier on. I believe that fatality is an unfortunate expression here because it's way too broad for the purpose. So I suggest that we rephrase it, for instance, to occupational related fatality, which this is about.
So you're suggesting the term is occupational fatality?
Yeah,
Not
the
the def-
definition is fine, but the term itself is not correct in my opinion.
You put it in a parentheses, like fatality, parentheses, occupational, as it would appear in a dictionary? for example?
No, it's not necessarily on the premises. It can be outside the premises.
No, I think
but it
his
should be
suggestion was that
occupational.
it be fatalities and then parentheses, occupational, or something to that effect to reflect what it is.
Yeah.
So, Chelsea?
The response that we'd originally given Kirsten, although certainly worth discussing in this forum, was that we expect that this would be one of the terms that will be reviewed in the OH&S working group, which has already been approved by the GSSB to commence as a number one priority following the transition. So it may be that we note it to be fixed and the fix happens a bit later.
Well, just on that point, how's it used in the standards itself?
Work-related fatality.
So can we just change it to work-related fatality so it matches how it's in terms of in the glossary? So it links directly back to how we've used the terminology, which I assume Kristen is okay? Okay, I suggest we make that change. Let's see, I had Daniel and then Dwight.
Yeah, so I had a question and a comment. My question is, could you remind us, or if there even is, criteria for what gets into the glossary? I mean, when do we decide that a term gets into the glossary? And then that leads to my other question, which is on 250. We have human rights clause, human rights review, human rights screening, but we don't define human rights. And I'm wondering if we should have a definition of human rights.
Bastian or Chelsea?
Well, I think I can refer to the history of this, and that is that different groups at different points in time have highlighted terms that they felt need further explanation and don't have a common understanding with the user group of the guidelines. That is how this has originated. And that also leads in this particular instance for the human rights clause review and screening. When this was introduced, these were fairly new concepts, and the working group back then felt that this should be highlighted. And there was no process in terms of criteria in the past to decide which particular terms get highlighted in the glossary. I think there's been a screening as part of this process also, and things like the examples, this has been reduced significantly, and a lot of individual terms clarified, but going forward, as Chelsea has said, next to format style of individual definitions that go into the glossary, we'll have to have a criteria set for deciding what gets put into this.
So that's great. Is there I won't say a quick, but is there a consensus definition of human rights? I mean, just to the. Yeah, hang on.
Well, no.
If the answer is,
I don't think that there is probably a dictionary definition that we could put in, but venturing into that space of defining it now in detail, I wouldn't recommend it.
Do you have an intervention on this topic?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Actually, we don't define human rights. We list human rights. What would be the fundamental rights of being a human being? So the UN Convention there are at least 3 conventions from UN that lists the human rights. And we are referring to those conventions all around in several other SRS. maybe we should include this reference within the glossary. So when we are speaking about human rights, we're speaking about the rights listed within those three conventions. All the frameworks that are working with human rights are referring to the conventions. We don't supposed to define human rights.
So rather than us defining it, we would make reference to other UN conventions for human right definitions. I don't know. Bastian, do you have a response to that?
Well, only insofar that the individual SRS that concern individual rights that are set out internationally, they have all these references already. So the background sections have these references, and also in the reference list that is included. Yeah, well, we've tried in the past to with expert groups to come up with this one short description, and there was always an issue with that. So.
Dwight, do you have an intervention on this topic? Okay.
I think it's not the conventions. I think you might be referring to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the two covenants, which collectively these three instruments are called the International Bill of Human Rights. But they are not the limit of what is recognized as a human right internationally. And my recommendation is if we decide to define this, we will want to have the benefit of what probably exists as an authoritative definition. And I don't think we should presume to do this today.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Dwight, you had other comments?
Yes. Chelsea said that if there was a change, it had been noted in red, and I noticed in the definition of formal grievance mechanism, there's no change. But I seem to recall a discussion of the definition of grievance mechanism, and I would assume that was at the last meeting. And I would have been pretty insistent that there be a reference to the provision of remedy as something that all grievance mechanisms have to have in order to be grievance mechanisms. So I would recommend that the formal grievance mechanism be a system consisting of specified procedures, roles, and rules for methodically addressing complaints, providing remedy, as well as resolving disputes. And I think it's not a small matter. The GRI wants to align itself with with certain international authoritative instruments, including the OECD guidelines and the United Nations guiding principles for business and human rights. And in the guiding principles, you have grievance mechanisms in the pillar on remedy, and it's assumed and deliberate that they provide remedy, and I think it's a very important thing.
Okay, thank you. Chelsea?
Thank you, Dwight. This is why it's great to have new eyes looking at this. We did actually address that last time, and it was updated in the first glossary, which went out with the first set of standards. So the definition that was published in the first exposure draft was system consisting of procedures, roles, and rules for receiving complaints and providing remedy, with a note, which was reviewed by the GSSB, and the definition was for grievance mechanism. So we have overlooked marking that in the second set of terms. So thank you very much for calling that out, but probably no need to rediscuss if you're okay with that.
Other comments with regard to the glossary? So looping back to a couple of Michael's comments, it strikes me that to be true to the premise that was Sarah first reviewed, of not using the term in the definition, I am troubled a little bit by this business partner only being examples and not actually a definition. So I would like to see if we can't get that fixed. So Sarah?
Yes, I agree, and think that we can definitely work on a definition if the board would like that to happen. Again, this is transitioning things from G4 directly over, and it seemed like this was potentially a complicated definition to write, but we can definitely put the.
Well, my guess is it will be, but, and if there is, and maybe Michael has a ready definition for us that we might talk about, but are other board members interested or feel that we do need to do a better job of defining rather than giving examples? Yeah, okay. Michael, do you have a comment?
Well, I was just going to suggest that if we don't have a definition, and it could be complex to get agreement on it, that we take the definition away and just put the examples into the guidance.
How many instances is that likely to entail in the standards? So, if we put it one place, if we take it out of the glossary, then we have to insert that in every place that it appears.
I think for business partners, there will be a few impacts, and it hits some of the exposure drafts in the first set. But we're happy to have a look at it over the course of the morning and come back with some options a little later today, if that would be amenable.
Yeah, if we could just, maybe do a search and see, how many would be impacted. I mean, it is a helpful suggestion, so thank you, Michael, in terms of how we might do that, because I do think it might take a little time to get to a consents definition of business partner. Do you have any other comment there, Michael? Okay.
I mean, the other one is you could put a very innocuous definition in partner in business and then put, as a note, put all the examples as a placeholder.
Okay. Salama?
Maybe you should think to use the legal, international, well-recognized definition for business partners. I have 2 or 3 to provide to you during the break time. But it's a legal definition. It might be the better solution to use now.
Okay. Dwight?
Yes, I'm bothered by 2 things. One, of course, is we did agree that we would follow the practice of having a definition be a sentence that could substitute for, and so I'm not sure how this managed to slip through and still find its way in there. But the other thing I'm bothered by is my understanding of a partnership is a certain kind of business relationship. But you also have the word partnership that is a trendy word that sort of like is used to apply to relationships based upon some kind of cooperation and harmony and this and that. And so you have the trendy use of partnership, and then you have the more precise meaning of partnership as a certain kind of legal relationship. And I think that we need to probably look at the whole issue and see what we're using in the standards by when we talk about partners, whether we're trying to be trendy or referring to one of several kinds of business relationships. And so I think we need to I think we're doing the wrong thing. We're defining something where there's plenty of definitions already, and we're really not quite sure what we're trying to get at by using the word. So I would think we might want to take a look at the whole thing, and I would then recommend that you leave the word out right now.
Well, as we indicated, we'll find where we have made reference to business partner in the various standards that have either been out for public disclosure or the ones that we're going to talk about next to determine what the outcome is. I think the recommendation currently is, I think, that we would delete this definition, assuming that it is adequately covered in the guidance in the relevant standards. But I'd like to get a sense as to how many standards that entails. So we'll table that one for the moment. Daniel.
Yeah, just a point of editing 543 training. The term training is used throughout the definition. I think you need to use, and I think we've mentioned that we do need to go through all of it to make sure that we're not using the term to define the term. But that's one where it's repeated several times. Maybe the word instruction or education or something else can be used in its place.
The difficulty is that we've sort of, when we put it in, it seems to me that we put in the word training, and it was really so that we could use a shorthand for what it might cover without actually defining training. That this was a case of, when we talk about training, we mean all these things, but we don't actually define training. So it is a bit of a conundrum.
But then that goes back to what we just raised, which is
No, I
we
understand.
wanted to list examples, right?
I get the point. I'm just trying to understand why we did that. And I think it's because we wanted to, use a shorthand term to cover a number of things. And this probably wasn't the most effective way of doing that, perhaps. Bastian?
And the history to this is we receive questions about these kind of things, and over time, so people that were involved in this expert working group process try to fill that in, and so that's the reason that it is the way it is right now. The two options is we can take it out completely, then you lose that element of guidance, or it is that whenever training is actually mentioned, this is also highlighted in the guidance. That is another possibility, that it includes, or these are examples of what we refer to when we say training. That's and then this would leave the glossary. It would make the text longer.
Well, what if you treat it just like we did fatality, where you just say training and then parentheses workplace training, and then you say workplace training could be, then you list your list.
It seems to me the other possibility would be that training, and then the first sentence is, for purposes of the standards, GRI has defined training to include these things, without actually defining the term, but trying to get at why we're using it as a term. So it sort of says that by saying refers to, but I would be very explicit that says, for purposes of the GRI standards, the use of the word training is intended to encompass, the following. Chelsea?
Yeah, we do have some language in other places, like with young worker, we modified to say in the context of the GRI standards, this term refers to. So we can align that, certainly, no problem.
Yeah, because I think, Daniel, what do you think on that? Is that, you okay with that? Okay. Other comments on that particular? Michael first.
I mean, that would cover business partner as well, and probably cover a number of things. Perhaps it's a change to the actual rules that we use for the glossary altogether. Yeah.
Dwight?
Well, I may not understand where we're moving towards, but I would not like to have a definition in this form. I would like to have the definition in the form that we discussed, and under the circumstances, I think this is guidance. It's not suitable for a definition. We're not achieving anything by defining this term this way, except for not achieving what we wanted to achieve and how we made definitions. So I think it's a bad idea.
Okay, other thoughts? Kirsten, sorry.
I support Dwight, especially as it's mentioned now here. It's very unfortunate saying as the definition of training, no, training does not include on-site coaching by supervisors, as I would claim that that's an extremely important part of training. Either it's by supervisors or it's by other colleagues, but it's probably the most important part of training. And for a specific disclosure, it could be okay that it's not included, but not in the general definition of training.
And that gets back to the specific use of training in the context of the standards. But Chelsea?
Yeah, we can look into bringing that into the training and education standard as guidance, if the GSSB feels that that's a more appropriate home for definitions that really refer just to the context. Would that be a good compromise?
Well, once again, I guess I'd like to get a sense of how many times we've used this term and how many standards we're going to ripple through here. All right, if you could, that would be useful. Michael?
Just as a mechanism, there will be cases where we use words across standards. We want to give some guidance across standards without repeating it everywhere, but we don't want to use a definition per se. I mean, that's what we're talking about, isn't it?
It is.
It is. So, I mean, it seems like maybe we've got a two-part I accept what Dwight says. This is not a definition of training, never will be. We're using the common English or common language definition of training, and we're just putting parameters around what we mean in context. So it just seems useful to have a place where we accumulate those things instead of having to repeat them. Whether you call that a definition in a glossary or you call it a two-part glossary with definitions and collective guidance or something, I don't know, but the idea seems useful.
GRI use of terms or something. Okay. Did you have something, Chelsea?
Yeah, we did. That is actually in line with the advice that we got back in January when we had an internal workshop with a standard setting expert. And one of the things we talked about was format structure of the glossary and how to deal with the kinds of inherited terms coming from G4. And his advice was that is not uncommon in other standards, that you would have a mix of some things which are more about examples and some things which are more classic definitions. So from the expertise that we were given, that is appropriate to do. I think it's also a style question for this group and how to make things as future-proof as possible. And you're right that there will be terms that we don't foresee that in the future they will be replicated in other standards, and we are able to update them much more easily if they actually live in a glossary rather than in 4 or 5 different topic-specific standards.
Not to try to, short-circuit or shortcut the answer, but is it a glossary of terms and GRI use of terms? Because I am also, that's why I continue to ask how many times we're going to ripple this thing, because if we, which we will, in all likelihood, want to alter a GRI use of a term, the ripple effect concerns me in terms of how many standards it impacts if we don't have a central repository for the concept of what we're doing. Daniel and then Dwight.
Yeah, and as the more we kind of get into this discussion, the more you can pick apart a whole bunch of pieces of the glossary. But, and I think it comes back to the need for criteria of what gets in, sort of a clear guideline of what we're going to put in what section. I'm looking at 286. We have basically an acronym, IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. I mean, we could have chosen a whole bunch of other acronyms or other organizations to put in here, and they're not in here. The very next one, lifelong learning, does that really need to be in a glossary? I mean, and I think maybe if we had that clearer criteria where we define, okay, our acronyms are going to be here, our real definitions are going to be here, and then sets of examples can be somewhere else, I think that'll really help. But I do think we need some sort of future guidance of what gets in and what doesn't.
No disagreement. Dwight?
Well, I thought we did agree that we wanted to have our definitions consist of a phrase that could be substituted for the word. And this does not happen here. Now, I suppose what we could do is come up with a phrase that could be substituted for the word, and then provide notes that would have these different things under it that would clarify what the word could be, and then we could go ahead with that form. And I think that would be all right. But I also think what we really should do is look back and see how we're using the word training, and see if there's a need for a definition because there's an ambiguity or a peculiar use that departs from the commonly understood meaning of the word, which is widely used. And that would be the first test. And then the second test would be, can we put as in a positive or in parentheses the information we need in that particular instance? And then that would be, I think, the second preferred way to go. And I think we would only get to a definition of training if, having done those two things, there was still a need. And then I would say you need to come up with the substitute phrase and then additional notes.
Bastian?
From the standards division side, I don't think there is a disagreement with that approach, and that is indeed what we discussed earlier on. But we are again faced with the reality that we're carrying over a lot of specific things that there's no expertise on these subject matters residing within the standards division, and we will need to clear that in future work processes. So this is arguably an in-between step, but pulling this entirely from the documents or the set of standards is probably also not the right way forward, because most of the what we now have under the definitions are terms that we receive frequently questions on, or people have decided at some point in time that they need some further explanation. Whether the explanation then is ideal in terms of style and everything, that's acknowledged. It is not. One way forward is that explicitly in the work process going forward for a review for individual standards, that we set out the expectations as agreed with the GSSB, and so that going forward, with each individual standard that is reviewed, we clear this glossary. I think this is the best we can do at this point in time. Going back into changing terms at this point is difficult, and not for the timing, it's just for the subject matter. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? We are at a point where we need to decide in a fairly basic way as to what the path forward. I guess I'm still a bit swayed by the idea that this is the glossary of GRI use of terms, and not a glossary of definitions. It's how we're using them, as opposed to a formal dictionary definition of a term, because it is a mix, and it is going to continue to be a mix until such time that we can either identify specific use in each of the standards, as Dwight just highlighted once again, or that we have gone through a appropriate vetting process to figure out with the appropriate experts what a definition is. So let me ask the question, just as a sort of a straw proposal. What's the sense of the board relative to a inelegant and perhaps inappropriate, but nonetheless a proposal to address some of these concerns by redefining the GRI standards glossary to the GRI standards glossary, or the GRI standards use of terms glossary, or something to that effect, as a way of, it's not pretty, but it's probably more truthful to what we have here than the individual defined definition. So, Salema?
I'm thinking about our objective to be in line with the majority of the other frameworks, and to be integrated with others' initiatives towards ESG information or management of social and environmental aspects. Then we are calling our glossary as the GRI use of terms. For me, it's a little bit it's awkward, because it translates me as I have my own definition of grievance mechanism or human rights. I wouldn't use this title, Eric. Well, if everybody else are agreeing with this title, I won't stop consensus. But I mean, I would simplify the title. It's a glossary of terms used, or the standards, GRI standards glossary of terms. It's simple.
Daniel?
Following on that last comment, I wouldn't undervalue the importance of maybe setting the standard for definition of terms. And maybe it is important that we give it a title that is a little bit more authoritative, in the sense that this can be a reference to other organizations on how you should use a term for reporting. And so if we just limit it to our interpretation and use, we're kind of setting our bar a little bit low, I think.
Directly on that point? All right, Dwight?
This discussion is taking place in the context of our Transition to Standards project. And I recall, although maybe not as well as I want to, but I recall that we actually had a discussion as to how we would deal with definitions. And it would be not unlike, for instance, the way definitions are dealt with by other standard-setting organizations, including, for instance, the ISO. And the value of a definition is 2 points. One is that it might be because within the standards you're using a word not in the same way it's commonly understood. Or you might be using a very technical word that would not necessarily be accessible by somebody using the standard. But either way, what you're doing is you're providing a definition, and the best practice in providing a definition is a short phrase that can substitute for that word. And I don't see any value in creating a more vague kind of section for the place of putting words. I think that we, in the transition to standards, we make a transition to the use of terms, and the definition of terms that we might need in the standards in a single place. And I think that would then determine the kind of entry we're making. And to say, well, this is how we're using the word, but you're still not providing a substitute for the word, is not good practice. And I don't think we can fix this problem by adding a new title, a thing. I think we need to do this right. And I think that for the purpose of the exposure draft, we need to go over these definitions and make sure that all of them have a substitutable clause, and which I don't think is going to be impossible to do. And that in the future, we set up criteria for what goes into this section, whatever we call it, and we also set up an understanding of how it's done. But I don't think the point of departure at this point is to sort of change the character of what we want this to be. I think we need this to be a proper exposition of terms and definitions for the standard and appropriate to standards.
Kirsten?
To a large degree, I agree with what Dwight is saying. My vision here going forward is that this should be referenced to training as defined by GRI is, etc., etc. Where it's possible, convenient, and relevant, I absolutely support Zulema's suggestion to use common definitions for it. Where it's not possible, we should create our own definitions. Back in my school days, there was one thing that was for sure: when we had to define something, we couldn't define something by saying what it wasn't. And that goes also with several of the definitions here. So we should definitely try to avoid that part.
Well, it certainly would have been useful to have this commentary prior to the meeting, but Michael?
I think we're trying to achieve two purposes with this document, and I don't see anything wrong with trying to achieve two purposes. It's a glossary of definitions and usage of terms. And what's the point of us defining training, for example? You know, it's just a common usage word. We don't have a special meaning to it. What we do have is a context, and we can explain that context in our usage of terms. So I understand what you mean by definitions and be precise. So if we called it a glossary of definitions and usage of terms, and when we define something, we say XYZ is defined as blah, blah, blah. And other times, you know, ABC is used to mean, or is used blah, 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 or, you know, wording like that, you know, to include or exclude or whatever. I think that's a perfectly legitimate use of this type of document.
Okay, thank you. Kirsten?
Just very short, I agree that my comments should have become up before the meeting, but they are being created by the discussion, and that's how it is, and that's what discussions are for.
No, I understand. Just a commentary. Dwight? Oh, I'm sorry, Chelsea, you had an... response?
Yeah, just in the course of this discussion, I've referred back to 4 or 5 glossaries of other comparable standards, and they all call themselves glossary or glossary of terms. So leaving that ambiguous addresses Michael's point that that actually covers both definitions and terms. And a number of them have a disclaimer at the front, which explains that this glossary includes both definitions and terms in the context of being applied to these standards. So I would suggest strongly that we don't make the title more confusing or complicated if the group doesn't feel. And I think we are in line with other good practice standard setting to include a mix of things. Certainly we can set better parameters for how these are developed going forward. No one disagrees with that.
Dwight?
If I were reading a standard, one of our disclosures, I don't think that, and it mentioned the word training, I don't think that I would then go to the terms and definitions, or whatever we're going to call it, to see what is the, oh, well, here's 4 options, and one of it is referring to paid educational leave. Well, that must be what they were going to do.
So there will be, for each term that has this additional explanation, there will be an indication in the text of the standard that this is the case. So we would always link that back.
It'll be bolded or hyperlinked, so it will be clear that there is a GRI use of the term that is referenced somewhere else.
Well, yes, but what I'm trying to say is I don't think that you need to go back and to any place else, even with hyperlink or at hyper speed, when you can just read in the standard that that we're talking now about paid educational leave, or we're talking about this or that, because I think it's much clearer to understand, and so that's not necessarily guidance. It's a question of plain language, so that you're communicating a thought, which I don't think is helped by putting someplace else. So I don't see it. In terms of in terms of where we were going with the definitions and the terms, I do recall that there was a discussion and that we wanted to do it this way with the substitutable phrase. I recall that, and so why would we have to comment on that again? I don't think it was necessary.
Just to clarify, it is indeed true that we've come to the conclusion early on that this was the approach that we aspire to, but we are faced with this reality of many of these things we cannot fix because there is no expertise in this room or with the standards division for the terms that we're looking at. And there are decisions taken in the past, or there have been decisions taken in the past to include certain things, and I think Kristen's example of calling out certain elements of training that are part of it not. Back then the group had agreed that this is what they want to write into this, the GRI guidelines. Now we have another opinion. What do we do at this point in time? I think that's the issue we are facing. Daniel?
I guess we need to be careful because something like training, which is so obvious, we know what training is, but who is going to go look for training in the glossary? Maybe someone who is doing their GRI report and says, okay, I need to report on training. What training? They go to the definition, and all of a sudden they're using the glossary as guidance, where it might be more important to have something like training in guidance because you can really explain further and not just in a single phrase what the definition is. So I think where we have terms in the glossary that really should be more elaborate and explained in terms of guidance, we be careful about not putting in what really should be in a guidance section.
Okay, thank you. Kristen?
To Bastian's comment, I certainly understand that this can be written into standards that we cannot change for now. And that was also why I gave the comment that it could be okay in a standard, even though I would probably fight it if we were discussing that certain content today. But what I am really opposing is to include such information as a part of a definition in the glossary, which is different from making a change to the standard itself. where, as Dwight said earlier, this is about recommendations, and it isn't about definitions.
Okay. So, Chelsea.
Can I propose a way forward at the moment, which would be to, it sounds like there's definitely a future conversation to have on what are the rules for defining terms and what's the best practice we want going forward. But for the sake of the current glossary draft, which is due to be publicly exposed, it might be worth asking members to come back to us with specific terms and wording suggestions that you think do actually need to be fixed before we go out for consultation, and we can have the team look at this offline over the next few hours or over the lunch break and represent it, or over the coffee break and represent it back to the group. We haven't captured specific wording changes at the moment following the discussion.
Okay. So I need to get a sense of the board's generally view. We've heard from a few individuals quite extensively. I guess I'd like to get a sense as to where the rest of the board is on this topic, because we certainly have the ability to table this and take it up at some future meeting, recognizing the impact that may have on at least the release of our glossary for public commentary, or we can, undertake to do some additional work yet today. So I guess I'd like to hear from those we haven't heard from in terms of where they are on this discussion. So, I don't know, Simeon or David, go ahead. David?
Our stakeholders look to GRI as an authoritative source, and so if we're going to provide a glossary, then it needs to be done right, and we need to have good explanations of the things that are in the glossary. Where there are examples here, I feel those examples should be in guidance in the particular standards, because they're not definitions. And what we do need to keep in mind is that it should be a benefit to the users. So Bastian has told us that we get a lot of questions around what do we mean by this and that. I think in many of those cases, if the answer is we want to give examples, that should be in the guidance of the particular standards and not in a glossary. In the glossary, we should have precise definitions and maybe references to authoritative sources.
Okay, thank you, David. Simeon?
Yeah, from a user's point of view, I have a similar feeling that if I were to get a definition, I would go to a glossary. And if I want to understand the context of that word to be used, I would like to see it in the standard itself, in the guidance, so that I don't have to keep going back to the glossary for a definition. That's not a place for examples or context kind of explanation. And but in the spirit of going forward with the public consultation, I do feel that it's probably okay to just let this go at this point in time and not make those changes now, because if we start making those changes, there's going to be quite a few of those, and I'm not sure whether it's the right time to do it. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Judy?
I think I feel quite similarly to Simeon. I absolutely recognize the problems that we have with this document, and that a lot of it is just ported over from the G4, and that in the course of creating the G4 in the first place, terms were defined according to the priorities set by individual working groups rather than by some overall strategic set of instructions that anyone had applied to that exercise. And I'm not entirely sure it's worth us right now trying to unravel all of that in the absence of kind of looking at the wider context of it. I'm not sure it's worth holding up the public exposure for, I think is what it comes down to for me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Stian?
Eric, I fully agree with what David, Simeon and Judy said. I think we should expose it and then pay attention to it going forward.
Yeah. Without any modification or?
With the text in red added as it is in front of us.
Okay, thank you. Nakuma?
I agree to Simeon that we should not hold up for the public exposure. But at the same time, if there are certain places like training, it is not defined. Those few of those glossaries, if we can change it, it's okay. Otherwise, we should not hold up. Let us go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hidemi?
Yeah, I agree too. And then basically, I think that I think this kind of definition should appear in each standard. But at this moment, I think that we can go with its current idea.
Okay, thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, I agree too. That just for ease of use, I think the more that we use the guidance, the easier these terms and definitions are going to be to pull out.
Okay, thank you. Did I miss anyone? I don't think so. Okay, so we have several options. I'm sorry, go ahead. Did you have? Chelsea?
Well, we have captured 2, possibly 3 specific changes. So the first was to change fatality to work-related fatality. The second was to delete the definition of formal grievance mechanisms from the glossary part 2, because this is captured by grievance mechanisms in the glossary part 1. And the third change, which the group can confirm, is that Lara has checked and we only reference the training definition in one standard, training and education. Although the term is used elsewhere, it doesn't reference the definition. So we can, as a temporary measure, bring that definition into the guidance in that standard if that is an okay compromise at the moment. Those are the only 3 specific changes we've noted so far.
In the case of the business partners? Where did, we don't have an answer yet on that?
We do. We have some very fast research going on over there, and it's used in 2 standards, anti-corruption and ethics and integrity section of general disclosures, which is already out for consultation, but we could bring it in at the moment into anti-corruption for the second round of consultation.
And eliminate it from the glossary.
And eliminate it from the glossary, yes.
Okay. David?
Just a quick question, Chelsea. Regarding Michael's point, the confusion that's caused by the use of "and" when we mean "and" or perhaps just "or," is that something that's going to be fixed?
I'm going to put that one back on you, David. I think changing "and" to "and/or" is a simple fix for us from an editing perspective, but it does have the potential to change meaning in cases. And this is where we struggle to understand the context of how those definitions were created. And without the specific subject expertise, we have the potential to alter actually the reporting requirement by just adding stroke and/or. So I would, if there are specific subject areas where you guys are experts and you know the definition is incorrect, then we're more than happy to make the modifications. This is the simplest thing we can fix. But I put it back on the group to make those judgment calls.
Daniel?
I would also remove the IUCN reference, 286. I don't think it has a place here.
Okay, thank you. Dwight?
Well, I share everybody's opinion that we should go ahead with the putting this out to the public, and so nothing I say would be against that. And I certainly agree with everything I've heard about the suggestions that might go in advance of that. I think we need to come up with a written policy about terms, and I would strongly suggest that we borrow this from the ISO. I think they've got it right, and I think we need in the future to proceed that way, and I think we need to go over our glossary and bring it in line with that, although not before the exposure.
Okay, thank you. Bastian?
What you see with other standard setting processes is that the terms of reference for working groups include the reference to these kind of processes that are set out by standards boards. And that's probably the way forward. I would suggest that we look at this issue again once we approve the next set of terms of references for working group processes, and that the standards division comes with a proposal for this specific issue, but maybe there are other things that we need to standardize. We are working on a style guide, for example, for the recommendations and the way we want to write things going forward, and that might be also part of the briefing of the working groups.
Yes, thank you. Michael?
I think some of these things, the and/or things, aren't actually subject matter knowledge. I mean, the one I looked at, or the one I referred, was community development program. You know, I don't think it could possibly mean everything in this definition has to be satisfied before you're talking about a community development program. And I'm certainly not a subject matter expert, but I think it's just a standard setting thing that this is imprecise language. It's not subject matter expertise, I don't think, in all these cases. So I think we should be able to do that going through and looking at these in a reasonably consistent way. And if we've got doubt, leave it. But I think often we won't have doubt. I think it's quite clear that these are incorrect or imprecise.
Okay, again, any very specific, you've noted one, if there are others, would be helpful. Simeon?
Also on this and/or issue, I know we're discussing the glossary document now, but I think that's a wider issue than the glossary. It is used throughout all the standards. So if we were to do a review, it ought to be sort of an overall review of all our requirements. And before we do that, we probably should have a decision on what we mean by and or and/or before we embark on that exercise. And it sounds like a mammoth task to be done at this point in time too. So, so I guess if there's any obvious places we can fix it now, but otherwise it needs to be a separate exercise. Yeah.
Just on that point, you know, I would hope that as we have looked at each of the requirements in these standards, that any consideration as to whether it is not precise enough in the use of and or in the shall statements that we have, I would hope will have already come to light. So you know, if it hasn't, and I do think it was raised at least in one case, and we did change it. So I think, you know, so I hope it's not a mammoth exercise, but it might be just to go find all those things. But I would hope in our individual review, as we've undertaken, particularly with an emphasis on the shall statements, that they are as precise as we mean them to be. So, you know, I agree with Michael in the terms of this definition and so on, but I would be quite concerned if we have a bunch of these that exist in the shell statements at this stage of our review process. So, Simeon?
Just to echo on that point, at least for the standards that I have committed to look at and that I've looked at, I didn't feel that it was a huge issue on this and/or problem that we have perceived now. So I actually feel quite comfortable that it's not really as big an issue as that we are perceiving it to be. But it just needs a general review. I think that's all we need here.
Well, except we need to keep in mind that, you know, we have 6 of these standards out for review already. We've got another 30 that we're asking somebody to go read in detail and determine whether there's something there or not. So all I'm suggesting is that, you know, I'm happy to undertake a review of the glossary and if people have some additional terminology, but I'm a bit concerned of tasking to go back and look at all of these standards once again, since they have been subject to our review and up until these 18 approval for dissemination to the public. So I'm not quite sure what to do with that recommendation other than what I just said. Judy has been waiting, so Judy.
Yeah, just to say that we've identified a number of challenges and problems that we think need to be fixed with the glossary and with the words in it with respect to where they appear in the standards and so forth. There's nothing to stop us making those changes in light of comments that we received during the public comment period. We'll understand, hopefully, a bit better about how the glossary gets used in practice. If people do actually read it during the public comment period. If they don't, that will also tell us something about how the glossary is not used. And we can make decisions at that stage about whether certain terms really should go inside the standards in question in guidance, whether certain terms are, it's a question of not definitions, but of GRI use of a term. For that reason, I'm actually quite comfortable with where we've landed in this conversation, that I think there are a few small sort of quick fixes that we can put on a few things that have been identified. The rest of it, I'm quite confident that we're capable of doing this following the public comment period without fundamentally altering anything about the standards or the glossary itself.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess what I would suggest is that we take our break. I will consult with our standards division as to where we are with regard to those changes that we think can be reasonably made, and with an understanding and a sense that I have that we should proceed with a release of a glossary of terms in some form. And so it's a matter of if we can quickly convene to sort through the half dozen or so specific changes that we would make now and see if we can't get to a point of consensus with the board on a release of the standard for the glossary. So I would, why don't we take our break now and try to reconvene at past to give us about 20 minutes. I'm sorry, Chelsea, go ahead.
This would be the opportunity for any other changes or high priority changes from GSSB members to be voiced to Eric or to us so that we can also incorporate those in what we share back.
Yeah, because my intention is to try to come up with a marked version of the changes that we're going to make. So if you have specific ones that you haven't given us, now's the time to step to the front table here and let your voice be heard. So we'll reconvene at 1:30 Thank you.